Hello, I'm Annette Young for those of you just joining us, and I'm filling in for Francois Picard, who's on a much-needed summer break. And welcome to The World This Week, which is, of course, in partnership with the Daily Beast, where we get 4 journalists to chew the fat over what made headlines in the last 7 days. And here to discuss them with me this Friday are Aaron Zaleski, the Paris-based correspondent for the Daily Beast, Régis Le Sommier, the deputy editor of Paris Match, Dov Alphon, Haaretz editor at large, who's based here also in Paris, and France 24's international affairs reporter, Leila Jacinto. Thanks to all 4 of you coming in, giving us some of your precious time. So, once again, Jerusalem is the focus of tensions, Palestinians having now returned to a key holy site in the city for the first time in 2 weeks, after Israel removed controversial security measures, including metal detectors. These measures being introduced by Israel after the killing of 2 Israeli police officers nearby. But the violence continues, with more than 130 people injured in clashes late last night as police overlooked as worshippers entered the site.
As of this morning, only men over the age of 50 are allowed on the Temple Mount, and women of all ages. After yesterday, when the Temple Mount was open to thousands of local Israeli residents, there were disturbances which erupted on the Temple Mount, which police units had to deal with, and dispersed individuals.
I call on all the children of Palestine to return to the Holy Mosque of al-aqsa. Come and give grace to God, and pray to Him to protect our holy place and our people. And pray also not to let the occupation continue to block our faithful from entering the Holy Mosque.
Tense times once again in Jerusalem. Dov Alphon, let me start by asking you, this was very much seen as a victory for Palestinians, with the Israelis coming off second best by the fact that they decided to remove all of those security devices. And it certainly angered the far right of Netanyahu's coalition, hasn't it?
Well, Netanyahu really reached the correct decision, as usual, after he tried all the wrong ones. So suddenly, he was playing his base. He was playing to the far right, and he declared that Israel is the only one who could decide that it needs metal detectors at this place because it is Israeli. And suddenly, it isn't. Suddenly, he has to ask Jordan. He has to ask the Waqf. And so his base suddenly is without the very strong language that Netanyahu used before. It really takes Netanyahu to know everything about the banana in front of him and still sleep on it. It's a signature decision by Netanyahu, and it's very clear that.
And this despite, as you were saying, the security services advising him to take those devices down.
Yeah, I think he really wanted to go a bit to his right because he has internal problems. The far-right newspaper founded by his one-time donor, Sheldon Adelson, is suddenly against him. He was trying to play really the far-right base, but it went awfully wrong for him, and it really now is... We could now guess that there will be very harsh decisions, maybe some kind of military operation somewhere, anything that could present Netanyahu as still the champion of a strong Israel.
Aaron, in any case, the violence was continuing last night, and once again it also reveals the significance of small gestures in that part of the world. I mean, for all of us in other parts of the world, putting up metal detectors is really nothing of a major concern, but, you know, anything of the slightest gesture carries so much weight, doesn't it?
Exactly. It does carry a lot of significance, and I think it's also significant in the long run, I think, for lasting peace in the Middle East. It may be less about this big deal that Trump is talking about and more about a series of small gestures from both sides.
Régis, do you think the Palestinians can use this victory as leverage?
It's hard to say. What I see in that is that maybe a little bit of overconfidence on the part of Netanyahu, thinking he can push the envelope. You know, he had a rather easy ride internationally with Trump welcoming him and Macron making the gesture, and really pushing aside all these domestic problems that he has. I think he wanted to push it, and then he cannot afford a new intifada, I think. And he has many other problems, like, the ever-growing presence of Hezbollah, which, is a major key player in the Syrian war now, and key player in the Middle East at large. So Netanyahu has, lots of things on his plate. But internationally, he was welcome, and he wanted, as we know, that's his character. That's the type of a guy who's going to, want more every time. And this time around, that could have, gone overboard. And he went as far as he could, and then, but things are not settled. And for the Palestinian, that's maybe a way to take back the ball and cast the Palestinian cause in a new light.
Leila, one interesting element about all of this was the absence of America. I mean, it took them 11 days to send in a special envoy. It certainly does appear that America, or Washington rather, is no longer the go-to power for the region.
Well, as it happened, this deal was reached, and Jordan played a critical role while the U.S. representative Jason Greenblatt was in town. But that really doesn't mean that Washington played any role in this. I mean, Washington. Nobody really believes that the U.S. is anymore an unbiased mediator in this conflict, and under the Trump administration, even less so. The U.S. ambassador to Israel is David Friedman, and he, with Greenblatt, even before Trump was in power, was sworn in, said that they would move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. So the Washington's whatever cards it had as some sort of objective mediator in all this is absolutely finished for now. And one thing that's really different this time is that, these uprisings, there've been a mass of these disparate, these stabbings, running over with the car, it's not an organized group. This really seems to be like some sort of grassroots anger that's bubbling up, which makes it even more difficult for Israeli security services. I mean, you've been a Middle East correspondent. You know how effective the Israeli security services are. They are absolutely clued in and plugged into getting intelligence from the Palestinians, etc. But there is no leader here. There is, so these are really Israeli security failures, which I'm sure Netanyahu is going to have to answer to. And also, Jerusalem has always been the start of an intifada. So, this is why this is also critical. And it's this nebulous nature of this uprising that is confounding everybody now.
Dova, I'm interested to hear what you say, given what...
I think what we see is really a trompe-l'oeil, because I believe that the army, having said, please do not put these metal detectors on this place, the security services having said, please do not put these metal detectors on this place, then suddenly they play the Palestinians a bit. I do believe that what we see really is the Israeli army talking to the prime minister via the Palestinians. And so they could allow demonstrations, and they certainly didn't do enough. Indeed, a failure. But is it really a failure? Or is it a very, very comfortable failure for them to show the prime minister that if they say something, if their recommendation is do not put metal detectors, then they want next time to be listened to.
It is also serves as a timely reminder for us, because I think what's happened in the last few years, that part of the world has been overshadowed, hasn't it, Reggie, about what's going on in neighbouring Syria and other parts of the Arab world. And we've sort of, we've taken our attention away from Jerusalem, haven't we?
Absolutely, and from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict at large. I mean, this is a starking reminder that there is still a problem in Israel, and there is still a problem, and things are far from being solved because of the overwhelming presence of the conflict in Iraq, in Syria, and at large in the Middle East. And things have changed. The perspective has changed. It used to be like 10 years ago when we talked about this region, one time out of two, it would be about Jerusalem. It would be about some sort of things happening. The wall. Remember the building of the wall and all that, all the violence that's, spread out 10 years ago. Nowadays, what's happening in Syria has changed a lot of things. And, and we are reminded that, these old conflict is still there.
Moving on and staying in the region, and a diplomatic coup this week for French President Emmanuel Macron in getting two rival leaders in Libya to sign off on a conditional ceasefire, holding a summit in Paris with Fayez al-Sarraj, the UN-backed Prime Minister in Tripoli, and General Khalifa Haftar, the renegade general in command of the eastern part of the country. The new French leader convinced the two to reach an agreement. But as the Financial Times writes, the prize, of course, is huge. Since Gaddafi was deposed back in 2011, the North African country has been plunged into civil war and chaos. For many, it's become a prime hub for terrorists. There are also concerns about energy security given its oil and gas resources and, crucially, its main source, or rather that it is the main source of thousands of immigrants arriving on Italian shores every week. Let's take a listen to what President Macron had to say on Tuesday.
I firmly believe that civil war is not unavoidable and that dialogue and peace can succeed. That is what today demonstrates, and it is for this that I want to thank you today.
Regis, I'm going to come back to you because, you've worked in that part of the world. So what are the chances of this ceasefire actually working, given the fact that the country is incredibly fractured and it's sort of, enormous number of militias running around?
Yeah, but, we can say, in fairness that Emmanuel Macron has managed to have, two of the main key players in the area together, that's maybe one first step in a country that's in shade. It's Libya, ever since the international intervention with the French leading the pack in 2011, was a disaster. I mean, basically, it was our little Iraq. Let's or Sarkozy's little Iraq, right? Not far from our border. Now there has been some improvement on the ground. The worst part of the decomposition of the Libyan states was reached when the Islamic State really created a colony over there in Sirte and held the ground, like almost 200 kilometers of coast was held by the Islamic State. The Islamic State has proxy everywhere, but that was the only place where the Islamic State was able to really root itself. And it proved the fact that, along with Iraq, whenever in a country the institution and the state fails, then the Islamic State is able to gain ground. And that was now, a lot of its fighter has been defeated. There are still a number of places near Derna, for instance, near Benghazi, where they still have sympathizer and they still have militants. Al-Qaeda is also very present in various groups over there. And we've seen, with the bombing in Manchester, that they have ties and they're able to actually strike in Europe. So this is a very deep, very accurate danger from this country, which is not far away from our coast. And last thing, it's not that this deal is a major, but I say it's one first step. It needs to be followed up by a number of other
because I was going to say one party that wasn't impressed with Emmanuel Macron were the Italians, because they weren't briefed, were they?
Yes, and the Italian foreign minister said that there are too many deals, there are too many players, and there are too many initiatives. However, I sort of do not want to get distracted by this little hissy fight between Italy and France when the problems of Libya are so many and so complex, and we really don't understand. I mean, two things. One is Macron got two of them together. Siraj is a man who will go anywhere. And Khalifa is a man who nobody wanted to see. So, in terms of bringing these two together, I really, yes, it was another initiative. And France has the power that Italy doesn't have to put this on the front table. And ceasefire, these two men are not battling each other. Exactly. What we did get instead is a de facto acknowledgement of Khalifa, and France 24 had an interview with the general, and there were some very telling aspects of this man, and there's and you understand exactly why he's so controversial and is absolutely unpopular in Libya. And if we are going to try and put the future of Libya together with Khalifa Haftar, I mean, he obviously has territory, so he's someone that we need to negotiate with. I
He's
agree
one of
with
the
that.
big guys. I mean,
Yes,
especially when it
but
comes to
his
Eastern
discourse
Libya.
is so alarming. Anyone who disagrees with him is a terrorist. That includes the Muslim Brotherhood. He's he's taking a position on the Gulf crisis against Qatar. If you're going to put the future of Libya in this man's hands, this is not a solution for an end to a crisis.
Erin, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was definitely a PR coup for Macron, for this new French, very young president. I think the meeting was an essential first step, but I think, as other people were mentioning, the ceasefire really has very little meaning. There's so many players in this conflict, and I think even hours after they announced the ceasefire, the party of the Muslim Brotherhood said, "Well, we're not going to follow this." So you can't really have a ceasefire if all players are not going to accept it.
I would just add something to this. I wouldn't underestimate the influence of Jean-Yves Le Drian in that, because while he was the Ministry of Defense, I mean, Jean-Yves Le Drian had created a tight relation with Egypt. And Haftar and Egypt are, sort of like on the same line. And so if that was possible, it's probably because he was, making it possible. I think it's one of the legacy of this super minister of, army minister of France, and who's now, the foreign minister.
Now, the other element to this story, we're not going to have time to listen to what the French leader had to say when he announced it, but he did talk about earlier in the week the creation of hotspots, centres in Libya for people seeking refuge in Europe, and where people would be pre-screened for asylum claims. Dov, the interesting thing about this, however, is that a day or so, or even later in the day, he sort of walked back a bit from the idea. Of course,
because it is irrealizable. It's really funny. It's almost comical if it wasn't for a tragedy this way. It's if you could put hotstops pre-screening in Libya, then these people would not need asylum at all in Europe. You can't put pre-screening asylum centers in Libya because this country is in shambles, and therefore this is precisely the reason why you can't do it. So announcing immediately afterwards that this is the first thing you want to do in Libya was very strange. It's a misstep. And correctly so, it was immediately corrected a few hours later.
But it's part of his plan to put France back there on the global stage, making a stamp.
Totally. It's 9 out of 10, I think. He's really very good on that, on the PR side.
Leila, what would you say to that?
No, I absolutely agree. Yes, of course, we'd like to, tackle this migrant crisis at its root, at its base. But Libya right now is not in a position to hold French centers. We'll have another Benghazi scandal like Clinton had.
Okay, at this point we're going to just press the pause button and take a break, and I'll be back shortly with the second part of The World This Week. Hello, I'm Annette Young, filling in for Francois Picard, and welcome back to the second part of The World This Week, which is, of course, in partnership with the Daily Beast, where we get 4 journalists to chew the fat over what's been making headlines in the last 7 days. And here with me this Friday are Erin Zaleski, the Paris-based correspondent for the Daily Beast, also a regular, Régis Le Sommier, the deputy editor of Paris Match, Dov Alphon, the Haaretz editor-at-large, also based here in Paris, and France 24's very own international affairs reporter, Leila Jacinto. And Venezuela is on the brink. The country that was once one of Latin America's wealthiest nations has been rocked by clashes between the opposition and the government of President Nicolas Maduro, who's determined to proceed with a national election this Sunday. As a result, he's banned protests that could affect the controversial vote for a new constituent assembly. Prison terms of between 5 to 10 years could be imposed on anybody who contravenes that ban. And the situation has worsened to the point that the US has started ordering various members of its diplomatic staff, along with family members living at the embassy in Caracas, to evacuate the country.
I propose to the Venezuelan political opposition that it abandons the road to insurrection that it returns to the Constitution and that in the coming hours we begin a roundtable dialogue, national agreement and reconciliation of the homeland.
But Jacinta, unlike the Middle East, we actually did see a bit of action coming out of Washington this week on this one, and with the US government announcing that there would be sanctions targeting 13 senior officials. Is this going to be a productive move, or is there a danger that it could backfire?
Well, Washington's intervention is necessary at this stage. Although with Venezuela, it is always very tricky for the U.S. because Maduro will periodically ratchet up his leftist rhetoric against the capitalist enemy, etc. So Washington has always had to play Venezuela carefully. But I think these sanctions did send a real signal, because Venezuela is the third largest oil exporter to the U.S. and among the 13 people who have been on this list of economic sanctions include senior oil ministry officials. So this was definitely a signal, and at a time that is that the opposition is really looking for any support that it can get. But as I said, Washington has to play this very carefully. Really going forward, what I'm going to be watching for really is how is the Venezuelan military going to respond to that, because the opposition is really using all its cards, and we've got barely 48 hours now to this critical vote, which is going to go ahead.
And the interesting thing at this point, the military is saying that they're backing Maduro, but in that opposition-supported referendum a couple of weeks back, it actually asked people whether they would push the army to take their side.
And just one thing, when it comes to sanctions, that would be an interesting section of people to watch, because Maduro has kept some of these top generals loyal through various corruption, etc. So, if the international community would like to expand that list, that's a particular segment to look at.
Erin, the situation does appear to be passing the point of no return. This new Constituent Assembly, comprising, I think, around 545 members, is going to rival the National Assembly, which, of course, is controlled by the opposition. Are we seeing the end of democracy as we know it in Venezuela?
It would appear to be that way. It definitely seems to, especially the president, is getting more and more dictatorial. And even in his public statements, what strikes me is this complete disconnect between what he says and what his people are doing out on the street. Even there was a general strike last week, if you remember. And in interviews, he was telling the local press, "Oh, well, no one's going to participate. Everyone just wants to work. It's not going to happen." And then, of course, it turned out to be this, quite a large number of people got involved in that.
Dov, there doesn't appear to be a happy ever after ending with this story, does there, at this point?
No, and we see it from Paris, where revolutions happened a lot of times, and when a leader says, "Stay home," and when the military say, "We back the military leader, we back the elected president," it's never very good signs. And these are, I'm afraid, the first signs of a great deterioration. But I hope we're all wrong, and next week we'll see some kind of democratic return.
I don't know so much if it's the death of democracy, but it's definitely the birth of even more clashes, because he's very unpopular, and they do have a real civil society organization, unlike, for instance, in Turkey, where Erdogan has managed the same steps, rewriting the constitution, etc., but his base is so firmly behind him. Maduro doesn't have that.
He only has a quarter of the population.
Maduro is no Chavez, of course, and that we know. But also we have to take into account that this type of riot has been going on for quite a while now. We reached the figure of 100 people killed in the course of 3 months, which could, it's not full-blown civil war, but it could lead to something like, more critical as the day go by. And as, the problem is with the sanction that you mentioned, I would just add one thing is of course, the U.S. stepping in is always not a wise a bit everywhere in Latin America with what happened in the past. I don't know if Maduro will be skilled enough to use this in terms of saying they're sanctioning us, they're sanctioning the people. This through the government. And we know the price, especially when it comes to oil, which is the main export Venezuela, well, then the price of oil has gone down, and and of course it's been a very huge problem for the country. So will he be smart enough in order to play it in his own hand and trying to say that look, capitalism is coming,
well, he certainly
and save his presidency with that? But
he certainly,
I doubt it. But
every time he stands in front of a crowd, he sort of mentions Donald Trump as the big baddie in all of this.
Yeah, Donald Trump has been quite useful for a number of people worldwide.
This is true. This is true,
So
and yes,
this is another example.
Yeah, but and the U.S. has a terrible history in its backyard. But I don't think Venezuelans are buying this. Of course, there are the Chavista, his hardcore supporters who will take this. But for a lot of Venezuelans who don't have toilet paper, who can't even get milk for their children. I don't think this is going to cut that much anymore. Maduro railing against the imperialist enemy, really.
What do you think, Leila, is going to happen in terms of regional impact? Because, this could spill over in a way that we don't know at this point in time.
I think if there's any solution, it has to come from the region. And Canada could play a role in this. Didn't the Pope try to intervene in this crisis?
Yes.
Yes,
he did.
Yes.
But I mean, and we now have the former Spanish Prime Minister Zapatero leading back-channel talks. But I'm sort of interested about, are the days of the Bolivarian Revolution now numbered? I mean, and can the other neighbouring countries step in and play their part in seeking peace?
I really don't see how they could. I mean, what are their options? Sanctions, negotiations, dragging the parties to some sort of reconciliation. I mean, frankly, I don't think Maduro seems particularly in the mood to back down right now. I really see that this is going to continue.
Yeah, and that's the frightening thing, isn't it, Regis?
It is, but you mentioned the Bolivarian movement. We have, with the exception of maybe Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, who still, claim that it is a great idea. I think this is some element that, tends to disappear, and we're looking maybe at a country that is at a turning point. Where does he want to go? Where does, And this is usually a terrible moment that can lead to disasters, unfortunately.
It's not just a political crisis, it's an economic crisis. And they're both feeding each other. And that's what makes it complicated.
And it's certainly something that stems back for years with the collapse of the oil price and the fact of various measures that began with Chavez and have since been continued by Maduro. Okay, well, let's move on. And another week means another 7 days in Trumpland. And the US leader is facing numerous investigations into ties with Russia during his election campaign. However, the latest attempt to repeal the Obama-era Healthcare Act has failed after a rather dramatic night in the US Senate. At least 3 Republicans, including Senator John McCain, voted against the bill, which needed a simple majority to pass. And this is what President Trump had to say, tweeted. He says, because that's how he communicates, 3 Republicans and 48 Democrats let the American people down. As I said from the beginning, let Obamacare implode, then deal watch. So there you go. Erin, disaster for the Trump administration, one would say.
It is a huge blow. I mean, in addition to everything else, in addition to the ongoing collusion with the collusion investigation regarding Russia during the election. I would say this is an even bigger blow because this was his first major piece of legislation that he was trying to get through, and it just hit the wall.
It does appear too that public mood has shifted somewhat from the beginning of the year, doesn't it? I mean, there are now more and more people speaking out in favour of Obamacare.
There are, because I think the U.S. is the only nation in the developed world that doesn't have universal health care. And I think more people were benefiting from Obamacare than were maybe willing to admit in the beginning. And as McCain was noting, this new bill, there wasn't a lot of transparency. There wasn't a lot of detail. We're going to repeal it. We're going to change it. But there wasn't enough substance for enough people to get behind it.
Where does this leave the Senate Republicans? Are they going to have to be forced, God forbid, to work with the Democrats?
Well, I mean, Trump said, let it implode and then deal watch. But actually, there's not much that can be done about it. I mean, this was the barest minimum that the Senate could have voted on. I mean, this is skeletal compared to what the House voted on. So I think this is dead. Right now, they're going to have to move on, and if they do reopen this healthcare chapter, it's going to go back to negotiations, to the committees, to come up with something substantive. So I really don't think this can come up again in Congress this year.
Dov, one of the things that I was speaking to our Washington correspondent earlier about this evening in regards to the story is that the feeling on the Hill among the Republicans is that the president is somewhat had his attention directed elsewhere, obviously with the Russian inquiries, but more recently with the appointment of his new communications director, Anthony Scaramucci, who had a very lively conversation with a journalist from The New Yorker. And as a result, people on the Hill feel that his attention is not being where it should be, and that is trying to push this bill through. Thank you, Anthony Scaramucci.
Yeah, we can't even quote what the guy said. Now, he's a communication director. You can't quote him. This is extraordinary, really. And it appears from the last hours that there are tons of monologues, maybe half an hour, that the New Yorker didn't publish because it was off record. Now, if that was on record, just imagine what was off the record. This is frightening because this is really one of the most important countries. Still, let's not forget it. And when you see its administration rolling like, it's like a banana republic who ran out of bananas. Mr. Trump has absolutely nothing to shoot now. And it's crazy.
But, I will go a little bit on Trump's side when
please do. Please do.
I think you have to.
You have to remember that he's probably he's not doing very well in the polls, but in the states that voted for him, he's still above 50% in the states that made the election. So meaning, for his base, he's still an acceptable guy. I mean, and he speaks for them. The way they like his style basically, and that hasn't changed much, and that will need to change in order for him not to get reelected the next time.
I think that the important number is what the Republicans in those states think about. This is what the Republican Party is watching all the time. Mm-hmm. So, and it could begin to tip off. I think it's not Trump now. We're talking.
Look at all the partial elections that were held. I mean, the Republicans won it, not with a landslide, but they made it.
After presidential, I don't know.
Midterm election would be critical, I guess, for the Trump presidency.
There's a lot of tweets still then.
Yes.
A lot of tweets.
And also the mechanics
basically, he's not dead. So.
Right, and the mechanics of governing is where he's failing. And on internet, if people voted for Trump, regardless of, they didn't even realize that they were going to lose their healthcare initiative. If they supported him before the election, they will continue to. What are we going to do? But what's going to happen is Robert Mueller's investigation into allegations of collusion from Russia. They're really looking very seriously at how they can bring him down legally.
Well, if it's material for impeachment, but that's again another thing. We've heard that over and over and over. But, and when it comes to put the matter on the table, then there's his son that is accused. It's Michael Flynn. But it's never him. So he's not going to be impeached that way. So Mueller is important. I agree.
Coming back to what I was saying earlier, though, about the fact that there clearly is a breakdown happening within the West Wing, and which the mooch now is against the likes of Steve Bannon. Erin, that does not bode well for any administration when you've got people openly fighting against one another, and clearly as a result, government's almost coming to a halt.
No, I mentioned this earlier, that there's so much infighting and it's only been 6 months. And I don't know, it's a theory of mine that what just happened in Israel, why did they not send over traditionally, you'd send over a Secretary of State to deal with that. Why did they send the envoy instead?
Where was Rex?
Where was nobody knows. Where was he? And so there's just been all this infighting and nothing is getting done.
Well, another example is, isn't there somebody who can tell him that, like, for instance, Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese government? and that Lebanon technically is not fighting Hezbollah. That's because that's what he said, alongside with Hariri. That was enormous. That was one of the, nonsense comment that he said this week. And isn't there somebody that could, prepare ahead of time and tell him, a little bit of the reality?
Well, Macron will enter on the international stage. And, maybe the EU will finally start...
Macron is his friend.
Yes.
Or at least a good, firm handshaker.
Yes, and Bridget is in great...
Likes holding my hand.
He's also coming under fire for the transgender military ban.
Which is I want to talk about now, but before I do, I'd just like you to know, and I think you'll be relieved to hear, that when he was asked by a reporter a few minutes ago about the Obamacare Act, he said, "Don't worry, it will be fine." So, and then, as we were just saying, behold another tweet this week that resulted in yet another Twitter storm. President Trump declaring that transgender people would not be allowed to serve in the US military. Well, that didn't go down too well, did it, Dolph?
I suppose that, like Netanyahu, really, he was trying to play his base. And I think that in the States and in the Republican Party, it goes pretty well. But it didn't, it's a small problem also. When you see the percentage, he said, it cost us a lot of money. When you see the numbers, it's ridiculous. So I think, once again, it's something, it looks like a good idea, and the guy simply goes to his phone and tweets something. There's absolutely no administration, no really kind of reasonable people around him, and it's frightening.
Do you know if there are transgender people in the Israeli army?
I think, well, it's still in the stage of don't ask, don't tell. So I can't really give numbers, but of course there are a lot of LGBT in the Israeli army, yes.
Well, especially given that there's compulsory military service,
Yes,
so
they
there's a lot of, you
have no choice.
You don't have much to say, obviously. Erin, though, do you think this is just a convenient diversion as the going gets tough with these Russia inquiries?
You never know with Trump. It seems to be a tweet first and ask questions later, or tweet first and try to push policy through later. It hasn't gone over well. Even among Republicans have been critical about it, saying, we don't need, someone was quoted in the press, we don't need this, we need a hearing. How could you make a decision on an issue like this that would affect people who are serving now and who may want to serve in the future by tweeting it out? So people found that just really, his method, his announcement of it, just really baffling. And his argument was that I consulted with the military and they're behind me. And in fact, that turned out not to be true.
Regis?
Well, I think, tweeting is a means of communication. So it's a little bit too much communication and not enough, actually doing the work. And that's a bit what's been said about Macron as well. It's a little too much communication, and let's see, can he deliver? We're still at that phase. There's these two presidents have just been elected. That's one, but the way Trump is handling things is not looking good. But can he deliver? Can he actually pass a piece of legislation? Repealing Obamacare would have been.
He can stay at the Twitter interface. Simply go to messages instead of tweeting. That's the only way.
Maybe
he simply has to use
that.
exactly same Twitter if he likes. Yeah. Simply message your stuff instead of telling the American people.
Leila, do you have a final say on Donald Trump and his tweets this week?
No, I'm just I feel like we've discussed Trump way too much, and I always complain at the cost of other stories that should be covered.
Tweet about
I'm happy to end this.
Okay, well, at that point, that's it for this edition of The World This Week. Coming up next, Media Watch. And time now for Media Watch, and I'm joined here by Emma James, who's been looking at that rather foul-mouthed interview that we were talking about just earlier. That certainly got the whole world talking.
It really has. It's one of those stories that when it drops on Twitter, suddenly it is all that anyone is talking about. And certainly when I got home last night, the whole of my Twitter feed was just awash with comments about Anthony Scaramucci, because, of course, it is the new White House communications director who has certainly managed to steal all the headlines and steal a lot of the focus away from other much bigger stories, it has to be said. We were certainly told that he was colourful before he took the post. This interview in The New Yorker really revealed just how colourful he was, or is, I should say. He spoke to Ryan Lizza on the phone. And according to Mr. Scaramucci, he didn't think it was on the record, but he basically waxed lyrical. I don't know if that's really the right phrase to use, but there we go. It was certainly very revealing. And what he was so outraged about was actually this tweet, which seems fairly innocuous, talking about the fact that Mr. Scaramucci was dining with Donald Trump, Sean Hannity and a former Fox News executive, Bill Shine. In the tweet that follows, it's attributed to a senior White House official that Melania was there too. And of course, Anthony Scaramucci has been talking a great deal about going to war on leaks in the White House. So in this phone call, he threatened to sack his entire department, talked about Reince Priebus, the chief of staff. He clearly thinks that Reince Priebus is in on this operation, saying that this is evidence that his rivals in the West Wing are against him and are actually leaking to reporters to sort of to put him in a bad light, shall we say. He then said, if you want to leak something, he'll be asked to resign very shortly, talking about Reince Priebus. An amazing comment to make about your colleague. Now, that's all pretty shocking. And also the scale of the division in the White House that this reveals, because, of course, Reince Priebus was the man who brought in Sean Spicer. Sean Spicer, the minute Scaramucci arrived, he said adios, and that was it. He was out. But, of course, it's not all of these amazing revelations that have caused the fuss. It is the language that has been used. Newsrooms around the world have been debating whether or not they should actually publish exactly what he said.
Apparently there were crisis meetings at the New York Times editorial board.
Absolutely. Well, this is the tweet from Clifford Levy, who is the deputy editor at the New York Times. And what he says is, we concluded that it was newsworthy that a top Trump aide used such language. He goes on to say, we didn't want our readers to have to search elsewhere to find out what he said. It is one of those problems. You know, in the days of the internet, you don't just buy one paper, you look everywhere. What is interesting to note, though, although they did publish the whole thing, in subsequent articles, they have tended to go for other little phrases such as tirades, New York attitude, trash talk, explosion of profanity. The Washington Post, too, went in their headline with vulgar tirade, it's worth noting. The UK's Mirror newspaper decided to go with a few asterisks to shield readers from the extent of the vulgarity. And interestingly, Fox News was so concerned about the content of what he said, they actually bleeped out a word that isn't an expletive. So there we go. But yes, it is quite amazing. Obviously, we're governed by different limitations here on television, so I won't be repeating any of the words. But what I can tell you is that he referred to Reince Priebus as an effing paranoid schizophrenic. And that bit, including the alternative word for a rooster, well, let's just say he was trying to say that Steve Bannon is out to serve himself, not the president, unlike, of course, the mooch, who we know is a vision of loyalty. Remember that 2 years ago, he referred to the then candidate for presidency, Donald Trump, as an anti-American political hack who would be president only of the Queens County Bullies Association. So there we go. He is supposedly loyal to Donald Trump, but how long that will last for, we will wait and see. Now, he's tweeted again to say, I made a mistake in trusting a reporter. It won't happen again. However, it's understood from everybody that this was never supposed to be off the record. He has also apologised for his colourful language and says he won't be using that again. But looking at some of the other reactions to this, well, this Twitter user pointing out that it wasn't asked to be off the record, and he says Ryan Lizza welcomes Mooch to the big leagues because, of course, now he really does have to watch everything he says because he is the president's spokesperson. Michael Smerconish asks, how is it that that interview isn't an immediate fireable offence? I think we've gone into the kind of territory where nothing matters anymore. What is very interesting to note, though, is that Breitbart, of course, founded by Steve Bannon, the chief strategist who, among others, was criticised by Scaramucci in that interview, they have very much showed their colours. They are very much in Bannon's corner. And I think they're trying to play some psychological games with the president, because what they say in this article is, move over, President Donald Trump, you are yesterday's news. It seems like this is now the Anthony Scaramucci show. Well, if you remember when the Saturday Night Live started talking about Steve Bannon being the real power behind the throne, suddenly Steve Bannon started to disappear from view. So a lot of people are wondering if the same thing could happen here.
Especially given the mooch has made such a splash in his first few days in the job. Thanks for that, Emma James. And that's it for this edition. Do stay with us here in France 24, as there'll be more news and headlines coming up at the top of the hour.